He was the greatest engineer of our time. He built 25 railway lines, over 100 bridges and tunnels, 8 pier and dock systems, 3 ships, and 1,200 miles of railway throughout England and Wales. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was born at Britton Street, Portsea, on the 9th of April, 1806. His father, Marc Isambard Brunel, was a French royalist, an outspoken critic of the Revolution, and was forced to flee Paris in 1793 during the Reign of Terror. He escaped to America and made his name as an architect and chief engineer in New York, before moving to England in 1799.
Before he fled France, he had met an English family, and he fell in love. He fell in love with the governess, and the governess was an English girl called Sophia Kingdom. He came to England to find her, but also with a big idea. Marc Brunel was the first person in the world to design a system of automated production. Briefly, the sailing ships of the time had wooden blocks to pull the sail up. So whenever a ship left port, it would carry hundreds of these blocks in the hold. And the Admiralty had 150 people, skilled craftsmen, working around the year making these blocks for the Navy. And what Marc Brunel did was he looked at the process of manufacture. He split it into 8 discrete tasks. He built a machine to perform each of those tasks, and a self-correcting machine which could be operated by unskilled people. And then, with Marc Brunel's system, the Admiralty was producing more blocks, more cheaply, and with only 30 unskilled workers.
But when his Battersea sawmill was destroyed by fire in 1814, his fortunes declined. He was made bankrupt and thrown into prison. Fortunately, however, the government bailed him out with a grant of £5,000. Young Isambard, aged 14, travelled to France to study engineering at the College of Caen in Normandy and the Lycée Henri IV in Paris. He also served an apprenticeship with Abraham Louis Breguet, a master craftsman skilled in the making of watches and scientific instruments, and returned to Britain 2 years later to join his father's engineering drawing office. The family lived at 98 Cheyne Walk, once part of Lindsay House. This is where he spent much of his childhood and adolescence. The house, although later refaced, still remains. In 1825, Mark Brunel began his most ambitious project, the construction of the Thames Tunnel.
Mark Brunel estimated 3 years would see the thing finished, but it actually took 18. The River Thames is only 1,200 feet wide at this point, which is why Brunel chose it for his tunnel, and also because there was land available for the construction on this side of the riverbank. It remains the largest bore ever. It was driven as one big tunnel and then split into two. And there are two carriageways, and now each carriageway serves as a tunnel for the tube trains, north and south. But as Brunel intended it, of course those carriageways would have been for horse-drawn carts moving cargo under the river from the 3,000 ships docking in the river every day. And outside the museum there's a shaft, and there is on the other side of the river as well, a shaft 50 feet in diameter, which was used for the construction of the tunnel, and when the tunnel opened to the public, that became the entry and the exit to the first tunnel under a river. But the plan was to build another shaft each side of the river, 4 times that size. So this would have been a monstrous, huge shaft with a helix ramp down which and up which horse-drawn vehicles could ascend and descend, moving cargo. Because the big ramps were never built, the horses couldn't get down there, the horses wouldn't go down the staircases, so although it was planned to move cargo, it actually opened as a pedestrian tunnel in 1843. It was, of course, a huge success as a visitor attraction, and the first day it opened there were 50,000 visitors. But they're only paying a penny each, and the business plan was for toll taken from carts moving cargo, and that never happened. That's why it failed financially in Brunel's lifetime. They began work here in 1825, and remember this was built by private investment, so you would invest in this project, and you'd invest because you thought it was going to succeed. So hopes were high, and Brunel built just outside the museum here a tower. Brunel's tower was built on a huge iron ring, a huge O with a sharp leading edge. And as the weight of the bricks grew heavier and heavier, so this tower sunk under its own weight into the soft earth. And then they lowered people inside who excavated underneath the rim and helped it on its way down. That took a couple of months. What began as a 50-foot tall tower was within 2 months a brick-lined shaft deep in the riverbank here. And then they began the process, the difficult process of tunnelling underneath the river. And Mark Brunel's shield, his patented tunnelling shield, was lowered down the shaft in sections, assembled at the bottom, and they began their arduous work of tunnelling underneath the river. And this was done in the most appalling conditions by men in cramped frames, lit by oil lamps, showered by sewage, dodging flames, which were pockets of methane gas or marsh gas ignited by the lamps that helped them see what they were doing. So it was an appalling project to work on. I mean, they're very well paid, but it was just awful. And in May 1827, the first flood happened. Fortunately, no one was killed, but it obviously was a huge setback, and a PR disaster. So Mark Brunel, whose health was not robust, had a stroke, and his son, Isambard Kingdom, took over as resident engineer. So although this is Mark Brunel's patented shield and it's his project, it is the first project that his son worked on. And young Brunel had a brainwave and a way of restoring public confidence in what was being lampooned as a failure. And he arranged for a banquet to be held underneath the River Thames. And in November 1827, they had what must have been the most extraordinary slap-up dinner party for all the great and good to dine underneath the River Thames. It worked very well, and clearly if you can go down the tunnel and have foie gras and a banquet, then you can invest in it and you can think of walking under there with safety and no apprehension. Unfortunately, 11 weeks later, after this wonderful, wonderful PR device, 11 weeks later there was a terrible flood and 6 men lost their lives, and young Brunel was nearly drowned. One night the river was high and the water erupted through the frames and carried young Isambard, King of Brunel, senseless along the tunnel and up to the top of the shaft just outside the museum, where he was rescued, more dead than alive, and sent to Bristol to convalesce.
The disaster almost jeopardized the entire project, and work was suspended for 8 years, being finally completed in 1843. It was the first tunnel to be built under a navigable river and was hailed as the 8th wonder of the world. In 1865, it was adapted to serve as a railway tunnel, a function it still retains as the East London line of the Underground. Today, an average of 14 million passengers travel through it each year. You can view the tunnel from Rotherhithe and Wapping station platforms, and it is depicted in the tiles at Wapping. It was while Isambard was convalescing in Bristol that he heard of plans to construct a bridge across the Avon at Clifton.
But his design was what he called his Egyptian thing. If you have a look at the pier that's immediately behind me, you could almost imagine the Egyptian hieroglyph in the shape, and of course he thought that there ought to be sphinxes on top. Well, they started construction, but here in Bristol in 1831 we had riots, business confidence in the city fell right away, there was a depression, and the whole thing was dogged by political and financial difficulties, so that by 1843 the piers were finished, but that was it. Nothing else happened. Not for 18 years, but 4 hours sleep a night and 40 cigars a day took their toll, and in 1859 he died. So the Institution of Civil Engineers resolved that they should complete the Clifton Suspension Bridge as his monument. So they purchased chains that were surplus to requirements from London, the old Hungerford Bridge, brought them here, added a third chain, widened the bridge a little from Brunel's design, and didn't bother with the sphinxes. And on the 8th of December 1864 it was opened to pedestrian traffic and opened to wheeled traffic the following January in 1865.
Although built for pedestrian and horse-drawn traffic, the bridge was so ingeniously constructed that it can now bear the weight of some 4 million cars a year, and has become a major route to the region's motorway network. It is also a structure of great beauty. Bristol decided that it also needed a rail link to London, if it was not to lose trade to Liverpool. Brunel was among the many applicants for a post on this new railway, and, as his record showed him to be a man of exceptional brilliance and ability, on the 7th of March 1833 he was appointed engineer-in-chief. That same year, the Bristol Company became what it still is, the Great Western Railway. Until Victorian times, travelling anywhere was uncomfortable and very slow. Brunel surveyed the route from London to Bristol by carriage, horseback, and on foot, travelling on rough, uneven, and muddy roads. One of his chief ambitions was to build a railway on which trains could run smoothly at high speeds. With this in view, he recommended a gauge of 7 foot and a quarter inch, commonly known as the broad gauge, believing that the 4 foot 8 and a half inch gauge, adopted by George Stephenson, was too narrow. The Great Western Railway directors, persuaded by the apparently excellent reasons for the innovation, agreed to it. The spacious carriages and larger engines that were possible on the broader track gave a steadier and more comfortable ride. The Vulcan and the North Star were the first locomotives to be employed on the line. The rolling stock of these early trains was modelled largely upon the stagecoach and post-chaise in the first and second classes, while the third-class passengers had to content themselves with open trucks. But the war of the gauges battled on. By the 1840s, anyone travelling from Birmingham to Bristol set out on a standard gauge train and changed at Gloucester to a broad gauge train for the rest of the journey, causing a delay of at least 16 minutes. Sometimes it took up to 5 hours to transfer goods from one railway to the other, causing total chaos. In 1846, a Royal Commission decided that, although the broad gauge was superior in terms of speed and quality of ride, the country needed a unified gauge. Out of 2,175 miles of track already laid, close on 2,000 were of standard gauge. So, after less than 20 years, the broad gauge was already doomed. For a period, a third rail was added to the broad gauge track, which allowed trains of both systems to run on the same line. Trains ran on the 22nd of May 1892, after which the final section from London to Penzance was converted to standard gauge. The commissioners recommended that the standard gauge should be adopted in the construction of all future railways. Great Western was eventually forced to conform, scrapping their wider engines and rolling stock and relaying their entire lines. Here, at the Great Western Society in Didcot, is a rare example of the broad gauge track and the authentically reconstructed Firefly broad gauge engine. While at Steam, the Great Western Museum in Swindon is preserved the impressive engine, the North Star. In 1832, Brunel began his association with the Bristol Docks Company, where he was engaged during the next 15 years in improving and modernizing the installations. He also worked at other docks, notably Plymouth, Cardiff and Milford Haven. By August 1933, Brunel had produced his overall plan for the Great Western Railway, placing the estimated cost at just short of £3 million. After 2 years of hard argument in Parliament, it received the royal assent. Impressive achievements on this route, still in use, include the viaducts at Hanwell and Chippenham and the Maidenhead Bridge. This elegant bridge had the longest and flattest semi-elliptical arches ever constructed of brickwork, each span being 128 feet, with a rise of only 24 feet.